So top 5 requested charts that we're going to be breaking down today, looking at Ethereum, Sui, Solana, XRP, and of course, Bitcoin as well. We'll save the altcoins for last, and we'll continue on with this, long thread of analysis that we've been having for many of these things for, multiple months now. So we'll start off with Ethereum. I should, however, let you know that we still got our summer sale going on for 20% off of any one of the programs or services that you can find in the Teachable link in the description below. The code is Summer20, summer in all capitals, and then literally just the number is 20. Anyways, from there, we shall go into Ethereum, and I want to pick up where we left off. Ethereum still wedging itself up against this $2,700 resistance right here, if you want to call it that. Basically, wherever the white moving average is, which is a 200 simple, which is more or less effectively lining up with the most recent price action pivot, which is 26.79. That is to say, as long as Ethereum is closing dailies below there, no breakout to be, excited about, and no sort of $3,000 targets plus until that does indeed happen. But for right now, Ethereum is kind of hinting at perhaps a breakdown in the other way, I suppose, but I would not call it I wouldn't call it that just yet. For Ethereum right here, I'd still need to see it close below Sunday, the 18th of May's low, which is 2320 is what I'm trying to say. As long as you're above there, I think that hopium still exists right here, but it is kind of wearing out its welcome. And I did make a post on Twitter very early this week. I think it was Monday, where I said, hey, if Ethereum doesn't break out in the next 3 days, or the next 2 to 3 days, like this thing is going to at least try some downside. And well, that was our downside move on Thursday. However, it is getting picked up a little bit right here, but I do want to again emphasize that there is really no further upside targets that are actionable, at least in my opinion, as long as Ethereum is again below this price action pivot at 26.79, that number in the top right side of the corner here. Anyways, very, very, very important. In fact, I would even say that that 18th, the Sunday low, is front runnable in terms of judging a real breakdown for Ethereum if Ethereum even just closed below Friday's low, which is 23.85. So, you could probably move that pivot up a little bit more, but if you do want to go by the book, then yes, it would be that prior one, 23.20 or so. Anyways, let's go ahead and look at the higher term timeframes. Let's go to the monthly first. The monthly does obviously have some hidden bullish divergence that was coming off of the last couple macro lows. That one is still active and available, but as you can see, really does require Ethereum on the monthly, so in the relatively short term, to remain above that red moving average, which is 2,400. So on a closing basis, that is why I do say if you see a daily close below Friday's low, okay, probably front runnable, that it's not going to hold that. And we do see, very likely a move back down to like 21 or 2,200 or so. But until that happens, I would still favor the BULAs here. Again, even with how shitty Ethereum has been for this cycle, it still would behoove me not to look at this one as at least, gonna try and move up north of 3,000. But hey, it is Ethereum after all, and just because it did well in the past doesn't mean it'll do well in the future. I mean, for even the last cycle, 2021, it did not actually outpace Bitcoin in terms of measuring from high to high. Now, I do also want to acknowledge that on the quarterly timeframe, which also will close alongside this monthly as well. So at the end of June, we'll get a new update. There is actually potential for hidden bullish divergence on this timeframe as well between the low of 2022 and the presuming the low here of 2025. But again, that would really require Ethereum to really not break down below, at minimum, that higher level that we spoke about earlier, which was effectively Friday's low. Now, on top of that, I do want to accurately give value to some of the issues here going on in the shorter term timeframes. Some perhaps warning signals, if you will. Daily timeframe is going to continue to see momentum shift to the downside as long as Ethereum is below 25.71. That's even lower than the upside breakout area of almost 2,700. The 2-day time frame is continuing to the downside hard here. This one closing tonight as well continues down as long as Ethereum's closing below 27.50 almost. 3-day time frame also coming down as long as Ethereum's below 26.16. 5-day time frame is going to have a fresh cross to the downside, not tomorrow night, but Monday night, assuming that things do remain below 26.50, which it is decently below right now. So, it's got some work to do. So what am I trying to say? If Ethereum is still below about 26.50 by Monday night's closure, you're going to see the daily, 2-day, 3-day, and 5-day all pointed in the same direction, which typically is how you do see a lot of these things break down, to be honest. Anyways, on top of that, monthly time frame is actually continuing down here as well. The pivot has shifted quite a fair bit. If you recall from last month, it was all the way at like 30 36 or 3,700. Now it's 3,100. And I should also acknowledge that there is, I already have it in here actually even a couple times, but there is a nice trendline regression that has been governing the last couple macro lows here. And I can imagine that this will test this trendline regression maybe this month, probably July, sometime between this month and July. So, if that does play out, then we should be expecting a bounce around there. So in the interim, does Ethereum just kind of trade trendless sideways in the short term while these things reset? I think that would be the bullish view. That does still set it up for a move north of 3,000, hopefully like decently above 3,000 for the Ethereum people's sake. Oh, by the way, that's the actual coupon code right there for all of the discounts, such as, the price action pivots, summer 20. But anyways, on topic, yeah. In the short term, if Ethereum just doesn't break down, that would be considered good, I guess. And again, breakdown would be effectively confirmed below Friday's low on a daily closing basis. Or if you want to, again, go by the book, 2320 would be the number to watch. Anyways, moving on from there, let's go to SUI. And SUI is... Let me put on my drawing tools right here. It's still following the LARP line that we drew out for this one quite some time ago. It hasn't necessarily got to the lower end of the LARP line as I drew it right here, but these aren't supposed to be like, one-to-one representations. I mean, otherwise I'd need to have like a real crystal ball, I guess. But as far as SUI goes, it's pretty simple here in the same way that judging a breakout for Ethereum would also be rather simple, in that any sort of a daily closure above the most recent price action pivot, which is 339 and a quarter. If you see a daily closure above there, then you do have, what would be considered a breakout from this, I guess it's a falling channel, being resolved to the upside. And at that point, you're probably going to test the top side of the channel, which is like 375, 380-ish region. Maybe even sets up SUI for an actual real try higher as this would start to really formulate itself as a low. But for right now, I should acknowledge that the higher term time frame still suggests a corrective look, to be quite frank with you. This one is very obviously corrective, actually, after being one of the better performers for this cycle, of course. But in that case, I want to get into the stochastic momentum signatures here, because it's actually a much different look than Ethereum. We can see that the daily time frame does have a slight amount of bullish divergence and is pointed up as long as SUI is closing above 309, which is doing a good job of, for today at least, trading at 328, 329-ish region. The 2-day time frame is already pretty much fully reset as well. That one turns up above 339. Again, we will get a new tick on this one, or a new close on this one tonight. So I imagine that pivot goes down coming into the new open, meaning that it'll be easier to get the daily and the 2-day momentum oscillators on the same side. The 3-day time frame, however, continues to the downside, as does the 5-day time frame, and I believe the weekly will actually turn down below 228, which is closing tomorrow. So we'll see how that one evolves. But yeah, if you're looking at the price action pivots here, it is painting a more bearish look, in the sense that you have this declining trend line as your upside sort of boundary, and you have this more or less sideways trend line kind of governing your lows here. So that would be declining highs with same lows. That's going to be a bearish bias, obviously. But again, I would be a little more open-minded with this thing, just because it was one of the better actors in this cycle. And while the short term, could confirm a short-term breakout above, again, 339 and a quarter, that wouldn't necessarily imply that this thing's going to break out to new highs above the 2025 highs. That still is rather far away. But it would put it in a position of power and probably imply that it's not going to get back down to the bottom end of this boundary right here. Here's the thing, though. Just like Ethereum on the monthly, one of the big things that's kind of kept us safe on this channel from getting, prematurely bullish on things like Ethereum is the monthly stochastic oscillator. As long as it is positioned to the downside, it's just best not to bet against that direction in terms of like long term. This one is going to be positioned to the downside, again, with minimal information here because it is rather new, but as long as you're below about 420, which is a great number and easy to remember. So, just be mindful of that, because as long as it's below there, this thing is consolidating at best after a pretty epic run in 2024, especially. Anyways, moving on from there, let's go into Solana. This one will be rather quick. As far as the monthly goes, same thing here. The monthly stochastic momentum pivot continues to the downside, opening up in June, and the momentum will continue to the downside as long as it's below 237 and a quarter. So it ain't fucking switching around anytime soon, I could say. As far as that goes, the daily time frame would be similar to Ethereum in that you have a very obvious breakout area if you can trade back above and preferably close back above this most recent price action pivot here, which is 187.5 or so. If you can, or not if you can, but if Solana can do that, then I'd be looking for a pretty sizable move up to 220, maybe 240. Maybe it just goes for the prior highs. But like I said, as long as this is positioned to the downside, I would treat it just like Ethereum. No matter how close things are, until it actually does force across the upside, you can't, at least I can't be looking reasonably towards a macro breakout. And personally, I think it's just better to kind of avoid as long as that condition is not met right there. As far as other higher term time frame momentum oscillators, we can see the daily time frame is going to give a little bit of a twist to the upside here. So perhaps a short term rally followed by the 2-day time frame, which is coming to the downside as long as you're below 173 and a third. 3-day time frame also coming down below 179 and 3/4 almost. 5-day time frame freshly down below 176. So if it does get a short term bounce here, I would really hold my horses with thinking that it's going to do anything of significance to the upside. Still think that's in turn, if I was going to draw out a LARP line for this one, do you think that it could very easily look something like this? Short term rally followed by another nice fall, ultimately puts in a higher low right there. If you can do something like that, that actually sets it up for a pretty good move, probably eats up a lot of time as well. So maybe the monthly stochastic oscillator resets at that point and then maybe gives a try to the upside. But I'd probably be looking for something like this. Again, I've seen a lot of very interesting comments on the interwebs recently. I would not necessarily consider this bearish. If even if it does do something like this, that would still be effectively a higher term time frame, higher low. So just kind of be aware of where we're at in the grand scheme of things. It's the summer. Summer's typically very, very boring. Not much going on. Not much. Certainly not much like actual market changing things go on in the summer, at least on average. So if something like this happened, that would basically be a range play on the higher term timeframes, fine, whatever. Anyways, moving on, we got a XRP, the old XRP here. I'll keep this one short and sweet as well. For XRP, where is your obvious breakout region? I mean, if you're on the higher term timeframe, it's going to be the 5-day right here. The price action pivot here to the upside, which is 265. But even then, you do see that there is this declining upside boundary here from the price action pivots indicator. That's at about $2.50, probably an early indication if XRP could get back above there, at least on a daily closing basis. Until then, I really do think that you are at best consolidating sideways between these two boundaries, 264 on the upside versus about 180 to the downside. You're basically in the middle of that as of right now, so not necessarily a position of power. 5-day time frame, stochastic momentum is getting ready to shift back onto the downside, assuming that this thing closed below 234 on Monday, and that is going to also be combined with, I think, the 2-day, still coming down below 227, the 3-day also coming down below 237, and the weekly, which actually will remain to the upside here, so fair enough. Anyways, this one, XRP, very similar to SUI, very similar to Solana, very similar to Ethereum in the sense that the monthly stochastic oscillator is actually given a fresh cross to the downside here. And again, my sort of rule with this is I'm not looking for any sort of major breakouts with, in this case, new all-time highs implied, as long as this is pointed to the downside. The current pivot is 282. That actually moved up from last month to this month. And effectively, I could just say, look, if XRP trades above the May highs, you're probably going to see that fall through. You're probably going to see, massively new all-time highs. You're probably going to see $4.5, $5, whatever it ended up being. But as long as you're below there, as long as XRP is below there, I do think that this correction drags on for longer. And even on the daily time frame here, you do see that this is effectively a falling channel, which typically do break out to the upside, statistically speaking, but it can remain within this channel for a while. So how would you confirm a breakout to the upside? It needs to close above, preferably this most recent price action pivot, which is 228.25. Above there, this thing should actually fly back up to the top side of the range, maybe even go for the monthly pivot, which would be kind of cool. Anyways, yes, okay, we've left the best for last, which is good old coins over here. I wanted to start off actually with the monthly look on Bitcoin on the HPDR indicator, because the monthly for CME looks really interesting right here. The bottom side of the current range at the 38.2 level is just below $97,000. And I do think, it's possible for Bitcoin to maybe play out a further correction down around there. I'm not really too fussed about the short term, but if this thing is bullish, we actually kind of expect a relatively explosive move to new highs, somewhere around about $125,000. sometime this summer. That doesn't necessarily sound right to me because summer is usually a boring time, but that's kind of what this one is suggesting. Granted, its ability to actually remain above that 38.2 level. Again, that is, if you want to be super exact, about 96,750. If we go down to the weekly time frame, which already closed for CME, I do still think that a short-term downside correction is probably more likely than not after the short-term bounce, which, yes, Bitcoin is having a nice bounce here for sure. We spoke about a bounce coming in on Friday, as with most of these things, to be fair. But on the weekly here for CME, there's that same play that we saw on the 5-day for spot price action with the HPR, where we see volatility is decreasing. So we're going into a contraction phase, or we're in a contraction phase, and price is rather far away from that median. And whenever I see something like that, it's almost a guarantee that at some point, there's not necessarily a time component of this, but at some point, there will be at minimum a test for price to that median. Now, because the median shifts around on each and every weekly new open, I'd imagine that this median is going to flip massively up from where it's at right now at like $87,000, probably to mid 90s if I had to guess. So at some point, yes, it's very, very likely for Bitcoin to make that reconnect with the median. It's probably going to be the end of this current corrective and consolidationary phase. At least in my opinion, that'd probably be the low. But for right now, we still haven't seen that actually happen. So I would still remain cautious towards a further correction to the downside. That also goes in alignment with the 3 EMA versus 21 EMA setup that we've been sharing throughout this week. And generally, we kind of expect these lows to come in between the end of the first week of June and the end of the second week of June. So we're going to be entering that time frame coming into this next coming week soon. So I figure if there is going to be another try to the downside, it probably happens between now and next Friday or Saturday. Something like this. At any rate, if and when it does happen, that's where I start to get quite excited again. But like I said, in the short term, does Bitcoin bounce a little bit more here? Well, I mean, it's already had a pretty good bounce, to be fair. Like maybe that's enough. If we look at the price action pivot trend line here, I'm actually curious to see if Bitcoin does close above it for the end of today. Wouldn't necessarily confirm a breakout to me. I still need to see it back above this one. This is really the sort of correct way of doing it if you want like a really high probability move, but would be an early indication. Especially if Bitcoin closed below this descending trend line, then yeah, that's pretty obvious signal that Bitcoin is going to come back down sooner rather than later and kind of test this low that we saw from this prior week. But yeah, other than that, I'll be signing off. As always, I want to wish you the best of best. We're going to continue on good old live stream here for Twitter, X, whatever the hell you want to call it. And we'll end there. As always, wish you the best of best. Take care, much love, and see you hopefully Sunday.